The searchlight from a Japanese destroyer swept the surface like a verdict, its beams skimming past our bow by inches. We stopped the engines and drifted in the black water off Vella La Vella, trying to vanish into the night. Aboard PT-164, 23 of us lay flat against the deck, holding our breath. Behind that prowling destroyer, 3 enemy transports rode low in the sea. Inside their holds, nearly 8,000 Japanese troops slept or sat, unaware that within minutes their voyage to Kolombagara would end in flame and sinking steel. The date was 19 July 1943. In exactly 4 minutes, we meant to strike. My palms ached around the twin 50 caliber mount. Next to me, Ensign Robert Dutch Vanderberg murmured range and bearing into the skipper's ear, Lieutenant Commander Arthur M. McPherson, while the green glow of the compass cast tiny circles of light on the deck. Hidden in the volcanic shadow of Vella La Vella, PT-168 and PT-171 lay waiting for our signal. We were small wooden boats with big torpedoes and even bigger orders. That night, we were America's covert hammer against Japanese sea movements. I am Chief Petty Officer Thomas "Tom" Harrigan, U.S. Naval Reserve, and I was among the men who proved that plywood boats could, under the right circumstances, sink iron transports. People often ask what it felt like to be part of one of the Navy's most secretive operations in 1943. The simple truth: we were too occupied with survival to consider posterity. We understood, plainly and terrifyingly, that failure meant those 8,000 soldiers would land at Kolombagara and reinforce positions that would cost American lives. Each torpedo we fired was a wager on saving hundreds of our comrades. Each enemy hull we sent under the waves might spare a mother at home a telegram she otherwise would not bear. To grasp how 3 small craft could threaten the powerful Navy, you must first understand the operational context of the Solomons in mid-1943. The Imperial Japanese Navy had made night operations a specialist art form. Since their success at Savo Island the previous August, when Allied cruisers were ambushed and sunk, they had perfected nocturnal maneuvers. Their sailors trained for months in fighting without radar. Visual lookout, practiced signal drills, and tight coordination gave them dominance after sunset. Their fast, repeated reinforcement runs, known to the Japanese as the Tokyo Express, kept troops and supplies flowing under cover of darkness. Allied sailors bitterly called it the Rat Run. Once night fell, the Japanese could move with near impunity. The U.S. Navy possessed larger ships and more powerful radars, but we were losing the war of darkness. Fleet tactics taught by pre-war theorists were ill-suited to the cramped, reef-studded channels of the Solomons. Our cruisers and destroyers, optimized for big ship engagements on open water, found themselves vulnerable in confined seas where ambush and surprise ruled. What we needed was an unexpected weapon, fast, quiet, and expendable, something the enemy would not anticipate until it was already upon them. Enter the PT boat. Built in secret yards from New Orleans to New York, the patrol torpedo boat was a product of improvisation and necessity. Roughly 80 feet long and 20 feet across, these hulls were laminated mahogany and plywood rather than steel. Their light construction made them fast and fragile. 3 Packard V12 engines, evolutions of the...
I first encountered a PT during training at the Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron Center in Melville, Rhode Island in February 1943. The boats felt like hot-rodded speedboats with warfits bolted on. Handling them required a different kind of seamanship, quick decisions, nerve, and a willingness to accept high casualty rates for outsized strategic effect. In the Solomons that summer, those qualities mattered more than steel thickness. That night off Vella La Vella, we slipped into position beneath the destroyer's cone of light. We watched the transport's silhouettes loom black against dim sky, watched dark figures moving on their decks as crews stoked boilers and prepared for the morning. The countdown in my head was exact. When the captain's hand dropped, we surged forward. Engines opened, torpedo officers released, and the white wakes cut the water toward enemy bellies. What followed was focused, brutal, and brief. Torpedoes found wood and steel. Explosions lit the wave crests and threw up fountains of spray that glowed ghostly for a heartbeat. The transports burned, listing as seams opened and holds flooded. Japanese sailors scrambled, fire hoses useless against internal detonation and burning fuel. In the aftermath, the sea was a chaotic field of wreckage, oil, and men clinging to flotsam. Landings for us that evening were secondary to survival and escape. The PT crew's successes in the Solomons did more than sink ships. They circumvented an enemy advantage and reshaped a campaign. Small boat attacks forced the Japanese to divert escorts, slow supply runs, and rethink the assumption that night was a sanctuary. For the Americans, the tactic bought time and space in a theater where every ton of men and material mattered. We operated in a world where hardware and human grit were inseparable. The boat's plywood skins and Packard roar meant vulnerability and speed in one package, and the men who crewed them accepted risk as a constant. Yet the combination, surprise, speed, and a willingness to do the unexpected, turned what seemed like minor craft into strategic weapons. On that July night, beneath the volcanic silhouette of Valla La Vella, 3 small torpedo boats rewrote the expected calculus of naval power.
I came into the PT program as a destroyer hand, fresh off convoy runs in the North Atlantic, when the Navy put out a call for men to sign up for a new, hazardous duty. The recruiter was blunt and mysterious. He wouldn't describe the boats, only that the job was dangerous and the expected casualty rate very high. From some 200 men who volunteered, 40 were chosen. I was picked because I could find my way by the stars and had cut my teeth in small craft on Chesapeake Bay. The first moment I set foot on PT-164, I thought someone had played a cruel joke on us. The thing looked less like a warship and more like a souped-up speedboat. Laminated mahogany hull, tight cramped bunks, and almost no armor to speak of. Living space was measured in inches, not rooms. Hot bunking wasn't optional, it was the rule. One lucky 20mm round or a good chunk from a cruiser splinter could have turned us into kindling. Still, once I met our skipper, Lieutenant Commander Arthur Mac McPherson, the boat started to make sense. Mac, older than most PT captains at 28 and already marked by Pearl Harbor and Midway, carried a kind of desperate calm. He'd volunteered for PT duty because he was done being the hunted. He wanted the ship that moved in the dark to be the hunter. Our crew was a strange, effective assortment, men who had never been assigned together on a conventional warship. Ensign Robert Dutch Vanderberg had been teaching mathematics at Yale. He could compute firing solutions in his head faster than most could juggle a slide rule. Chief motor machinists mate Carlos or Charlie Mendoza came straight from the West Coast hot rod scene and could tune our Packard engines until they ran like racing beasts or quiet kittens as the mission required. Our radio operator, William Sparks Patterson, arrived from the silent discipline of submarine duty and could keep a set talking in the noisiest of nights. And Patrick, or Patty O'Brien, our torpedo man and gunner's mate, treated each Mark 13 like a sacred relic, cleaning, balancing, and whispering to the bronze propellers as if coaxing them into obedience. Those fish weighed roughly 2,200 pounds apiece and were worth more than a house back home. Patty fussed over them like a man polishing a masterpiece. The rest of our dozen-man complement filled in the gaps. More gunners, our engineer, a cook who doubled as medic, and a handful of seamen who did the endless dirty work. We were a patchwork, black and white, ruffians and college boys, city men and farm kids, bound by the same contract. Every one of us had volunteered, and most of us understood that volunteering here meant we might not see the war's end. Training at Melville and Rhode Island was designed to strip out any useless habit. The Navy had learned the hard way that enthusiasm alone wouldn't keep a wooden boat afloat against steel and flak. We practiced high-speed torpedo runs until we could launch Mark 13s from a steely, rocking deck at over 40 knots and still hit a target. We trained in near-zero visibility, learning to navigate by sound, wake, and the faintest of cues when the tropics closed in with squalls. The instructor in charge, Commander Jim Patterson, a survivor of the Philippines and a man who had escaped from Corregidor on a thinning line of boats, taught a simple creed. The enemy expects you to play by the old naval rules. Break them.
He taught us to use the dark against them, to strike without warning, and to vanish before a counter could form. We arrived at Renard, or Renova, on 30 June 1943. The forward base rougher than any training harbor. There was no pretense of permanence, just a fuel dump, a few camouflaged Quonset huts, and a narrow pier choked by palms. The air smelled of diesel, rot, and the damp sweetness of jungle decay. In the distance, we could hear the dull thumps of Allied artillery pounding at Munda Airfield on New Georgia. The invasion was underway. Men were dying on the beaches, and our little boats were a tool to make the Japanese pay for every resupply. In action, PT tactics were simple and brutally effective. Approach quiet, launch in the dark, and get away before the escort could organize. We learned how to read an enemy convoy by sound, how many screws, the rhythm of a destroyer's turbines, the thump of a loaded transport, and how to place our shots so that one torpedo could disable a ship's pumps and send her to the bottom. The job required a sort of controlled recklessness. Trust your skipper, trust your engines, trust your crew, and be ready to swim if things went wrong.
Being a PT sailor was a different kind of seamanship. You had to accept that your craft might not survive a single engagement. You had to be willing to take risks that would horrify captains of bigger ships. But in those cramped plywood cockpits, something else grew. A fierce pride and a sense that the small could blunt the powerful. That belief carried us into the night off Vela Velella, to Kalimanjaro, and into a campaign where speed, stealth, and audacity changed the balance in the Solomons. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 9 operated a dozen wooden skiffs whose job, at least on paper, was straightforward. Patrol the channels of the Central Solomons and prevent Japanese reinforcements from reaching contested islands. In practice, the area was a labyrinth of coral shoals, jagged volcanic isles, and hidden enemy positions that turned every sortie into a navigation and survival test. The Japanese maintained seaplane scouts, shore-based coast watchers, and destroyer detachments trained specifically to hunt small craft. When everything went wrong, an ambush could come from any horizon. Our opening patrol on 5 July 1943 ended badly. We attempted to intercept a convoy near Visu Visu, but were detected by a Japanese reconnaissance floatplane before we could close. Within minutes, 4 destroyers bore down on us, searchlights stabbing the night and gun flashes outlining the sea. We scattered, weaving through reefs at top speed to avoid being cut down. PT-158 took a direct 5-inch shell hit and broke apart. 12 sailors gone in an instant as their boat disintegrated. We spent hours slipping between islands and tide rips before finally losing the escorts. No torpedoes were launched, no enemy ship was damaged. The cost of that failure was bitter and immediate. From the base at Renard, or Renova, that night, Mac held a quiet debrief. The message was plain. We were not destroyers and could not absorb cruiser-style exchanges. Our strength lay in ambush, concealment, and sudden violence. If we fought to the enemy's terms, we would simply be butchered. That lesson, bought with the lives of comrades, reshaped how we operated from then on. In the following weeks, we adapted through hard experience. We learned to approach within radar shadow zones cast by islands using landmasses to block detection. Running on a single engine at times, shutting the others down, reduced our acoustic and wake signature enough to slip past lookouts. We developed simple visual communications between boats, brief lantern flashes, and coded light signals that the Japanese listening nets could not interpret. Coordination among multiple boats became our force multiplier. Our human intelligence support was crucial. Australian coast watchers hidden in hills relayed ship movements over crackling radios. Indigenous Solomon Islanders risked brutal reprisals to paddle out and hand off sightings or canoe routes. Occasionally, decrypts from higher headquarters in Pearl Harbor supplied precise convoy timings, but more often we relied on pattern recognition and local reports to anticipate enemy movements. In July 1943, PT operations were still treated as something of a secret. Official communiques obscured our presence with references to small craft or mosquito boats,
and Japanese post-action reports initially blamed submarines or mines for the losses. Hardly believable.
We prepared meticulously. Patrick O'Brien ran his torpedo checklist again and again, setting Mark 13s for a shallow run and a calibrated speed so they would run true against a heavily loaded hull. Charlie Mendoza tuned the Packards and added mufflers to tame engine howl. Noise discipline could be the difference between surprise and discovery. Dutch Vanderberg recalculated approach headings, factoring moonrise, currents, and wind shifts until the plan felt fixed against any contingency. When sunset bled into the Solomons and the convoy moved into the strait, our little boats slipped into place, each man knowing precisely what his role would be. What followed that night would demonstrate how small, well-led units using local intelligence, stealth, and brutal efficiency could impose strategic effects disproportionate to their size. The convoy did not reach Kolombangara intact. Escorts were diverted, transports were struck, and the Japanese were forced to rethink the safety of night movements. From that moment on, the PT squadrons had altered the calculus of supply in the Central Solomons, proving that with cunning and audacity, plywood boats and determined crews could blunt a larger navy's advantages. I thumbed the feed on my twin 50s one last time, watching the belts run clean and loading only armor-piercing and incendiary rounds. Standard ball would do little against a merchant's plating, but AP and incendiaries could rip into a bridge house, ignite cargo, or silence an exposed gun crew. We threaded tracer rounds in every fifth belt, so our bursts drew lines in the dark, crude aiming aids, and a way to frighten anyone looking toward the sky. At 2030, we slipped our moorings and eased out into the thickening night, the 3 boats in column with engines muffled to a low and steady thrum. Once clear of the harbor, Mac ordered a quick weapons check. 12 machine guns and 3 20mm pieces barked into the empty sea. A short, sharp rehearsal, then silence again, only the wash against the hull and the distant hammer of artillery from New Georgia. The sea was rougher than we'd hoped, 2-foot seas that made fine torpedo shooting tricky, but also scattered wakes and masked some engine noise. Every small advantage mattered when 80 feet of plywood planned to take on 400-foot hulks. By 2300, we found our assigned station off Vela La Vela, cut to idle, and waited in a darkness so complete you could hear your own heartbeat. At 2347, Sparks pulled in a Coast Watcher transmission. 3 large ships, 2 escorting destroyers bearing 280 at 18 knots, range 15 miles. The hunt crystallized. We kept a low throttle, engines whispering as we closed to intercept. The mathematics were straightforward. If the convoy steamed at 18 knots and we could make 30+ in a burst, timing would put us in the narrowest corridor of Blackett Strait just as the transports passed, where maneuvering room would be nil. At 0018, Dutch picked them up with binoculars. Ordered silhouettes dark against stars, moving in textbook formation. 2 destroyers up front, 3 transports in the middle, another destroyer trailing. No lights, perfect spacing, perfect target. Mac's plan was brutal in its simplicity. PT-168 would peel in from port, PT-171 from starboard, and our hull would drive straight toward the lead transport, literally threading the gap between escorts to strike the center of the convoy. The risk was passing between gun mounts and searchlights at point.
For a moment, everything happened at once. Searchlights swung madly, deck crews shouted, anti-aircraft staccato opened from escorting ships, and tracer streams stitched the night. One transport shuddered as a torpedo found keel, metal rasped and flames licked cargo holds. Another coughed smoke and listed as fire spread. The convoy dissolved into chaotic gyrations. Destroyers swung to counterattack, attempting to bring main batteries and depth charges to bear, while lookouts scrambled for survivors and the transport's deck crews fought infernos. Shells splashed around us. One destroyer's main battery scored near misses that sent spray over our bow, and tracers stitched past the cockpit. We held our course long enough to fire additional tubes, rake another escort with AP bursts, and then peel away on pre-planned egress angles. The plan had always counted on speed and ambiguity. Strike in the center, make the enemy look inward, and use the islands and reefs to mask withdrawal. As we threaded back through the strait, the night lit by burning cargo and the concussion of detonations, we could see sailors leaping into the water in small boats from the transports, fighting to pick them up. The escorts were still active, throwing shells and hollering, but their formation was broken, their ability to protect the convoy destroyed for the night. We slipped into reef-shadowed channels, throttled back to ghost speeds, and melded with the island darkness while the enemy struggled to regain order. When dawn came, the tally showed the operation had worked. At least one transport heavily damaged and burning, another ablaze and possibly sinking, escorts badly jolted and forced to withdraw for damage control. More importantly, the reinforcement run had been interrupted. Dozens of troops would not reach Columbagara that night. We had paid a price in adrenaline and near misses. A PT in our squadron had taken shrapnel and several men were bruised and shaken, but the Japanese convoy had not completed its run. That night's action illustrated the PT boat doctrine in microcosm, using intelligence and local knowledge to place fast, lightly armored craft where they could exploit enemy vulnerabilities, striking hard and close, and then disappearing into coastal shadows before the enemy could mount an organized counter. The plywood boats didn't win fleet actions, but in the constrained waters of the Solomons, they could, and did, change the course of operations by turning supply into risk. The target ahead was a massive converted passenger liner. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers crowded inside, its decks blacked out except for the faint glow of watch lamps. The destroyer on our starboard flank finally spotted us, whipping its searchlight around and flooding the night with a blinding white glare. The beam caught us squarely, washing the sea in harsh brilliance. Almost instantly, their 25mm anti-aircraft guns erupted, sending arcs of green tracer fire slicing across the darkness. The sea around us exploded in tall columns of spray, the air filled with the mechanical howl of ricochets and the hiss of near misses. Then our torpedoes struck. The first slammed into the liner just after the bridge, detonating with a tremendous flash that turned the night briefly into day. The second hit square midships. The explosion lifted the vessel clear of the water, snapping its keel like a twig. For a heartbeat, it seemed to hover, then it broke in two, the halves sliding beneath the surface in a boiling cauldron of fire and steam. Through the glare of searchlights and the chatter of gunfire, we could see figures, hundreds of them, spilling into the sea, their cries carried over the roar of our engines.
Moments later, PT-168 found her mark. Both of her Mark 13s drove home into a second transport, a ship packed with ammunition and fuel. The detonation that followed was almost supernatural. An incandescent column of flame roared skyward, the shockwave slamming through our hull and knocking me off balance. A pulse of superheated air washed across the deck, setting small fires that we fought down with boots and bare hands. Burning fragments rained over the sea like meteors. The Japanese escorts, now fully alert, swung into the fight. But their predicament was severe. Their main batteries couldn't depress far enough to hit us, and with their own transports tangled in the melee, any broadside risked friendly fire. Their answer was simple and brutal: to ram. One destroyer heeled hard over, her sharp bow cutting toward us like a blade. The closing speed left us seconds. Mac spun the wheel and shoved the throttles forward until the engine screamed in protest. The boat pivoted in a spray of foam, missing the destroyer's bow by no more than 10 feet. As we passed her flank, I emptied a full belt of .50 caliber fire straight into her bridge, watching sparks dance and glass shatter under the impacts.
PT-171 under Lieutenant Joey Antonelli wasn't as fortunate. He had lined up a perfect run on the third transport when searchlights pinned him. A withering barrage from 25mm guns stitched across his bow. One round tore into a torpedo casing, but the weapon didn't detonate. It hadn't yet armed in the water. Wounded and taking on water, Joey had no choice but to pull out, trailing smoke. By now, every Japanese searchlight in the strait was sweeping the waves. The air throbbed with overlapping layers of gunfire, machine guns, cannon, and the deeper concussion of the big 5-inch guns finally coming to bear. The sea itself seemed alive with impacts, white geysers erupting all around us. "Fire the last fish and get us clear," Mac yelled above the chaos. Patty launched our final 2 torpedoes toward the remaining transport, but the enemy captain saw them coming. He swung hard, turning parallel to their tracks. Both weapons sliced harmlessly past his hull, trailing phosphorescent wakes. We had overstayed our welcome. All 3 engines roared at full power as we weaved through a curtain of splashes, fleeing back into the safety of darkness. Behind us, the battle raged on, the burning transport casting a hellish glow over the strait. PT-168, battered but still in the fight, managed to send one more torpedo into the ammunition ship already ablaze. The resulting detonation was cataclysmic. Secondary explosions rippled down her length until she vanished in a rolling fireball. 2 of the 3 transports were gone, nearly 6,000 enemy troops lost to the deep. The surviving transport and the destroyers, though intact, were disorganized and retreating. 5 miles south of the engagement zone, we regrouped. All 3 boats were damaged, but afloat. PT-171 was in dire shape, holes punched through her hull at the waterline, one engine dead, deck slick with fuel and blood. We came alongside to transfer the wounded, while the carpenter's mates stuffed mattresses and life jackets into the ruptures. PT-168 had lost her radio mast and taken shrapnel through the superstructure, but remained operational. Our own boat had somehow escaped serious harm, just scattered holes, a scorched gun barrel, and smoke stains from near misses. As dawn approached, the strait behind us still glowed faintly, smoke rising from the place where 2 Japanese transports had vanished. The mission's objective was complete. The convoy meant for Vela La Vela was broken, and the enemy's losses marked one more night where speed, audacity, and a handful of wooden boats had defied steel and fire. We lived to tell the tale, and the raid had done what we set out to do. 2 transports were sent to the bottom.
In the weeks that followed, the Japanese reworked how they resupplied forward garrisons. Convoys became less frequent and more heavily guarded. Escort complements increased. Reconnaissance patrols intensified. Those changes meant fewer materiel runs reached isolated garrisons, degrading the enemy's ability to reinforce and to conduct offensive operations. The psychological blow proved as consequential as the materiel one. Troops waiting for relief lost faith, and commanders hesitated to mount operations when supply lines were unreliable. Our success triggered rapid expansion of the PT program. New forward bases sprang up across the Solomons and New Guinea. Production turned out improved boats with better engines, rudimentary radar, and modest armor protection. And the tactics we had discovered facing fire and failure were formalized into training syllabi and passed on to new crews from Melville to Brisbane. What had been an experimental weapon became a standard tool of interdiction. The victory came at a cost. 2 weeks after our action, PT-166 struck a mine returning from patrol and was lost with all hands. PT-162 was caught in daylight with an engine out and was cut to pieces by destroyer gunfire. Only 3 men survived. Lieutenant Joey Antonelli, who had survived the Vela Valella run, was later killed by a sniper while refueling ashore. By the time I left for stateside duty in October 1943, our squadron had lost 7 boats and 73 shipmates. Yet, measured against the damage inflicted, more than 40 Japanese vessels sunk or disabled, and thousands of soldiers prevented from reinforcing front lines, the exchange, brutal as it was, had strategic effect. Boats could be rebuilt. Veteran crews could not be replaced overnight.
I returned to the Pacific in March 1944 as executive officer of PT 321 in the Philippines. The boots we sailed then were improved. Radar helped locate targets. Modest armor protected the bridge, and torpedoes were more reliable than the temperamental Mark 13s of 1943. But the essentials stayed the same: speed, surprise, and audacity. The Japanese never fully eliminated the PT threat. They tried hunter-killer groups, radar-equipped destroyers, and even suicide craft, yet they could not be omnipresent in every strait and night passage. The balance of disruption had shifted. Many of the men I served with went on to lives marked by that night. Mac McPherson survived, earned decorations including a Navy Cross and 2 Silver Stars, stayed in uniform, and later led destroyer squadrons in Korea. At his funeral, his son quoted him saying that PT service taught him the meaning of courage, doing what must be done despite fear. Dutch Vanderberg went back to academia and became a noted oceanographer, often remarking that threading ships at 40 knots through enemy formations taught him more about currents and seamanship than any classroom. Charlie Mendoza returned to building high-performance engines in California, translating wartime improvisations into hot rod lore. Patty O'Brien remained in the Navy and became the service's chief authority on torpedo maintenance, the man who wrote the handbook on keeping Mark 13s working. He never stopped speaking of pride of his fish that night in the Strait. PT operations do not occupy the largest chapters of the Pacific War narratives, but to those of us who rode these little wooden boats, they were pivotal. We demonstrated that a modest technical innovation, deployed with daring and local intelligence, could deny an enemy the freedom of the seas at night. The secret weapon had
Technological evolution accelerated alongside tactical innovation. The earliest PT designs were essentially high-speed civilian hulls pressed into combat. By war's end, they carried radar, rockets, improved torpedoes, and lighter forms of protection. Yet the mission concept remained constant: small, swift units delivering concentrated lethality with maximum surprise. The philosophy was not to match enemy strength ship for ship, but to exploit gaps, narrow passages, poor nighttime lookout discipline, and predictable convoy routes to inflict disproportionate damage. From a doctrinal perspective, PT operations introduced a new calculus to naval warfare: influence operations through contested littorals rather than decisive battles on the open sea. There are emblematic episodes that capture the essence of this change. In one late war action, a squadron of PTs harried the battleship Yamato, not to sink her, for the torpedoes could not pierce the battleship's armored build, but to disrupt and delay, buying time for friendly forces and complicating the enemy's operational plan. Small craft did not always deliver headline victories, but their presence forced adversaries to negotiate risk in ways they had not before. That indirect effect often proved life-saving for larger formations. The forward PT bases, Renovo, Tulagi, Mios, Wendon, and others, were austere outposts, cramped and squalid, more survival camp than comfort station. Conditions were primitive: sporadic mail, limited fresh food, and endemic illness. Yet morale among boat crews tended to be high because the men understood their missions had impact. Those operating in the Solomons did not act alone. They depended on a network of local allies. Indigenous coast watchers and islanders provided the eyes and ears that made ambushes possible. Many of these collaborators paid with their lives if discovered, and their assistance was indispensable. Without signals from the bush or canoe-borne guides through shoals and reefs, PTs would have been blind and far less effective. Radar became a decisive enabler. Early radar sets were crude and often produced false returns, but within a year the technology matured enough to permit reliable target detection at night and in low visibility. That capability allowed PT squadrons to find their quarry before the Japanese lookouts could, reversing the historical balance in nocturnal engagements. Where once the Japanese had relied on human vision and practiced night seamanship, American crews began to wage electronic nightcraft, using machines to extend their senses. Tactics developed iteratively.
Crews improvised countermeasures such as strips of foil to confuse enemy electronics, and they refined group attack patterns, wolf-pack-style approaches, where several boats converged from differing bearings to overwhelm defenses. Diversions were also used. Shore batteries or feint attacks would draw fire and reveal enemy dispositions, while PTs maneuvered into killing positions. Beyond dramatic torpedo assaults, PT crews conducted vital but less glamorous tasks, inserting and extracting coast watchers, evacuating isolated units, running ammunition to besieged garrisons, and guiding downed airmen to rescue points. Those missions rarely made headlines, yet they materially affected campaign outcomes by preserving combat power ashore and stabilizing logistics. The human cost of these operations was steep. These boats and their crews accepted a calculated risk: wooden hulls and light armament against steel escorts. Losses were recorded in boats and men, some killed instantly when mines detonated or when destroyers' guns found their mark. But the strategic calculus valued the disruption and attrition inflicted on Japanese supply lines above the individual boat's survival. Where the Japanese could not replace veteran crews and experienced captains readily, American industrial and training systems could replenish small craft and crews more readily. The asymmetry in human capital and production was decisive over the long run. After the war, many of the veterans translated their wartime experience into post-war careers that mirrored their wartime roles. Commanders who had learned small unit leadership took ships and squadrons into peacetime service. Engineers who had kept temperamental Packard engines alive became innovators in automotive and industrial design. Navigators and mathematicians moved into oceanography and related sciences. Their wartime improvisations, ad hoc repairs, novel tactics, and field solutions seeded civilian developments as well. The PT boat phenomenon is often overshadowed by larger naval battles, but its legacy is clear. It demonstrated that asymmetric tools, deployed smartly, can impose strategic constraint on a more conventionally powerful adversary. The boats forced the Japanese to divert. The small boat crews developed a level of intimacy rare in larger naval units. On a destroyer, a sailor might pass hundreds of shipmates without knowing more than a few names. Aboard an 80-foot torpedo boat, every man's habits and frailties were common knowledge. You learned who snored, who turned green in a seaway, who would hold steady when alarm screamed. Details that determined whether a crew survived a night mission. Those conditions forged attachments that outlasted service records. Decades later, PT reunions resembled family reunions because, in effect, we had become a family. Life aboard the boats was Spartan to the point of absurdity. The food, sea rations, Spam, and powdered eggs was the norm, and anything fresh was a prize bartered away in trade with supply ships. Fresh water was hoarded for drinking. Ablutions were seawater affairs that left salt crusts and raw skin. Coffee, black and unforgiving, was religion. Creativity became survival. Some crews improvised fishing techniques. Others swapped torpedo alcohol for fruit and vegetables. Maintenance never ceased. Salt, humidity, and high revs assaulted engines, wiring, and wooden hulls. Every man had to be a mechanic, carpenter, and electrician because a disabled engine in enemy waters was tantamount to a death sentence. Keeping the Packard engines running was not optional. It was literal life insurance. Weather in the Solomons shaped operations as fiercely as enemy action. Sudden squalls could rise out of placid seas and turn routine patrols into whitewater fights. Lightning could kill radios, and humidity ate fabric and wood. Yet those same storms offered cover. Cloud and rain blurred outlines, hid wakes, and muffled engine notes, letting the small, fast boats slip undetected between islands. Navigational skill mattered because charts were often outdated or flat wrong. Surveys decades old did little to reflect shifting reefs and new sandbars. Crews learned to read watercolor and wave behavior, to smell land, and to feel currents. When instruments failed, Seamanship filled the gap. Each sortie added to a collective mental map that no paper chart could replace. Japan's countermeasures evolved, but so did PT tactics. The enemy adapted by building shallow draft destroyers optimized for littoral hunting, deploying float planes for night reconnaissance, and experimenting with captured boats as decoys. In turn, PT units refined ambush techniques, using radar shadows cast by islands, throttling back engines to reduce acoustic signatures, coordinating multi-boat attacks with simple light signals the Japanese could not intercept, and timing strikes to enter narrow channels where large escorts could not maneuver effectively. It became a chess match performed at 40 knots, where every trick prompted another innovation. The psychological strain of constant exposure to mortal danger left deep marks. Crews lived under continual tension. Each patrol could be the last, so men developed coping mechanisms. For some, the stress cracked nerves and drove requests to be transferred away from PT duty. Others became addicted to the spike of fear and volunteered for ever riskier missions. Dark humor was a shield. Boats bore names like Grim Reaper or Sudden Death. Painted mascots on torpedoes mocked the danger. Those irreverent rituals were emotional armor, a way to make fear tolerable. PT operations also generated strategic reverberations beyond individual engagements. The convoy attack that sank transports and dispersed reinforcements did more than sink tonnage. It forced Tokyo Express planners to change doctrine. Escorts proliferated, convoys were consolidated, and sailings became rarer, measures that lengthened resupply times and reduced the flow of men and materiel to forward garrisons. The psychological effect on Japanese troops waiting for reinforcements that never arrived had operational consequences ashore. In other words, the boat's effectiveness multiplied, not only through hits and tonnage sunk, but by shaping enemy choices and imposing logistical friction. Technological change aided the PTs. Early radar units were primitive and often unreliable, but by late war improvements allowed night detection of ships and gave small boat commanders an edge the Japanese lacked. The combination of local intelligence, coast watchers, islanders, and occasional intercepted signals and emerging electronics turned nocturnal ambushes from opportunistic raids into repeatable, doctrinal operations. PT tactics and techniques were institutionalized. What had been trial and error at forward bases became formalized training doctrine exported to other theaters where fast attack craft were needed.
Personal trajectories after the war illustrate the variety of lessons turned outward. Mechanics became automotive innovators. Navigators and mathematicians entered oceanography and mapping. Officers took small unit leadership lessons into larger commands. The improvisations, repairs under fire, and tactical experiments conducted in remote anchorages translated into peacetime skills and institutional knowledge. In short, PT operations demonstrated a persistent principle of naval warfare. Where geography and surprise matter, modest platforms, innovatively employed, can produce strategic effects disproportionate to their size. The boats force the enemy to reconsider freedom of movement at night, to inflate escort demands, and to accept operational risk. Their story is not merely anecdotal heroism, it is a study in adaptation, how small, rapid units exploiting new technologies and human initiative changed theater-level outcomes. The plywood hauls and reckless courage that once plagued enemy supply routes left a doctrinal and technological heritage that endures in modern littoral warfare. That night, July 20th, 1943, 3 wooden torpedo boats slipped out of the Solomon's darkness and struck a well-escorted Japanese reinforcement convoy. The action itself was brief and brutal. Small, fast craft penetrated the formation, launched torpedoes at extremely close range, and left 2 troop transports broken and sinking.
Hundreds, perhaps thousands of soldiers who had been scheduled to reinforce the enemy garrison did not reach their destination. The mission's tactical purpose was simple: deny reinforcements and create strategic uncertainty in Tokyo Express routing. Its execution, however, reflected improvisation, seamanship, and a willingness to accept acute risk. These boats were not grand warships, but plywood speedboats fitted with powerful aircraft-derived Packard engines, light armament, and Mark 13 torpedoes. Crews were compact, 12 men or so, each of whom knew every other crew member's habits and limits. That intimacy translated into extraordinary operational cohesion under fire. The night patrol that intercepted the convoy relied on precise timing, quiet approach, local intelligence from coast watchers, and a navigation skill learned at sea rather than in classrooms. The attackers used the island's radar shadows, throttled back to minimize acoustic signature, and ran coordinated, simultaneous attacks that left escorts stunned and unable to bring main guns to bear without risking their own transports. The engagement unfolded in a compressed sequence. The boats drifted in ambush positions until the convoy entered the narrow strait, then accelerated to attack speed. Torpedoes were fired at very short ranges, producing detonations that split a large transport and ruptured another's midsection. The escort scrambled, searchlights blazed, and light-caliber guns stitched the night with falling shell splashes. The PTs working inside the convoy's perimeter exploited the escort's gun depression limits and the chaos of their own transport columns. One attacker narrowly avoided being rammed, another sustained serious damage and had to limp away. 2 transports were rendered unsalvageable, their loss immediately affecting the enemy timetable and eroding confidence in night resupply operations. The aftermath had consequences beyond tonnage sunk. Japanese command altered convoy doctrine. More escorts, changes in routing, increased use of reconnaissance float planes and searchlight-equipped vessels. Measures that slowed resupply, concentrated escorts, and imposed logistical friction on forward garrisons. Psychologically, the raid punctured the assumption that the night belonged to Tokyo Express runs. Commanders who had once relied on darkness to move men and material now had to assume that every shadow might conceal a fast attacker. For the small Allied force that carried out the attack,